we have only a very vague idea of the scale of repression within the country, because the regime is doing everything to hide the truth, to scare people into silence, and to eradicate dissent, and to create this warped image of reality for the international community that the entire Russian population stands behind Vladimir Putin. The truth is different. My husband was indeed arrested in April of 2022, and after a little more than a year in detention in Moscow, he was transferred to a strict regime prison colony in Omsk, Siberia. That's about 3,000 kilometers away from Moscow. Upon his arrival there on the 21st of September, he was put in a disciplinary cell. And he's still kept in this disciplinary cell, so basically it's prison within prison. That is a cell that measures about 3 meters by 1.5 meters, with a bed that is affixed to the wall from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., with a backless stool as the only piece of furniture that he has during the day. The cell has no heating, no hot water, and he has no contact with the outside world except through his lawyers, who are still thankfully able to see him, but we understand that the situation can change any day now, because just today we learned that 4 of Alexei Navalny's lawyers are being detained, arrested, and their searches are being conducted. So we understand that lawyers in Russia are now under extreme pressure from the authorities, because the authorities understand that they are the ones who make sure that those prisoners are not left without any contact with the outside world, that their families, their loved ones know what's happening to them, and the lawyers are also there to monitor the situation with human rights violations in Russian detention centers and prisons. So I don't know for how long I will have contact with my husband. He indeed has received the longest sentence so far. That might change as well, but so far he received the longest prison sentence for anyone who protested against the regime and against the war in Ukraine. My husband was accused of spreading so-called false information about the war in Ukraine. He was accused of working with an undesirable organization. He was labeled as a foreign agent, and then to top it all off, he was accused of high treason, based on 3 public speeches that he made on different international platforms, denouncing the war in Ukraine, demanding a Nuremberg-style tribunal for those responsible for the crime of aggression and war crimes committed in Ukraine. He talked about the constantly deteriorating situation with human rights in Russia, and he called about the illegitimate nature of Vladimir Putin's regime after the so-called referendum that basically destroyed the country's constitution and allowed Vladimir Putin to make himself into a Tsar. For that, a person in Russia today can be sentenced to 25 years of strict regime. But I also understand that my husband is seen by the Kremlin as its personal enemy, because my husband's opposition to Vladimir Putin goes decades back. Basically, he's been in the opposition to Vladimir Putin since Vladimir Putin came to power over 23 years ago. And since 2010, my husband has been actively involved in the advocacy for the Magnitsky sanctions. Those are targeted personal sanctions against human rights violators, and the Russian authorities have targeted anyone involved in this campaign. The author of this campaign, William Browder, for whom Sergei Magnitsky, a lawyer in Moscow, was working before he was assassinated in a detention center in Moscow in 2009, is on the wanted list by the Russian authorities. Boris Nemtsov, who was there, with whom my husband joined this campaign in 2010, was assassinated on the Bolshoi-Moskvoretsky Bridge in Moscow in 2015, and my husband was poisoned twice in 2015 and 2017. And thanks to an independent investigation by Bellingcat, The Insider, and Der Spiegel, we know that my husband had been followed before both attacks by the same people who had followed Boris Nemtsov before his assassination and who were implicated in the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. So there was a team of FSB operatives in the service of the Russian state whose only goal is to physically eliminate the opponents of Vladimir Putin. My husband was lucky to survive these two poisonings, both of which put him in a coma and then led to multiple organ failure. But he refused to abandon his fight. He continued. And today he is in prison, in a maximum security prison for a quarter of a century. My husband is truly a Renaissance man. He's a journalist, a filmmaker, a historian, a writer, but he's also a politician. And he's always identified himself, first of all, as a politician. And to him, he believes that he wouldn't have the right to call on the Russian people to continue opposing the regime from a safe place. He believes that he has to share the risks and challenges faced by Russians back home. To him, it is also unthinkable to give in to this intimidation, because this is exactly what the regime wants. It uses intimidation, it uses violence and aggression to scare people into silence. And Vladimir wanted to show, through his example as well, that giving in to fear is truly a choice that you can make. And he chose to stand with those Russians who were fighting back home. In Russia, internal repression and external aggression always go hand by hand. It has been so for years. The situation with human rights in Russia today is absolutely atrocious. The regime has banned all independent media. Over 210,000 online media resources were blocked by the Russian authorities since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. All remaining independent media in the country, Novaya Gazeta, Echo of Moscow, and TV Dosh, that was only available online, have been banned. There are no international observers or international rapporteurs on the situation in Russia allowed into the country. Human rights organizations are under constant pressure by the government, and Most of them have been declared undesirable or foreign agents, which means that they cannot continue operating within the country. Journalists are an impossible number of journalists have been forced to leave the country to continue the very important work of creating truthful informational content and trying to make it available to the Russian population from outside of the country. Lawyers, as I already mentioned, are under threat as well. And when human rights organizations give us the numbers, like for example, according to Memorial, Russia's most respected human rights organization and co-laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize of 2022, the number of political prisoners in Russia today reached 600 people. And this year marked the 20th anniversary of the imprisonment of the last hostage of the Yukos case, Alexei Pichugin, who's been held behind bars in violation of 2 decisions by the European Court of Human Rights. But Memorial itself says that although it is doing everything it can to monitor these cases, those numbers, the 600 political prisoners in today's Russia, is a very conservative one. Other organizations like, for example, Ovede Info, which is an independent media that monitors the situation with political persecution in Russia, gives us the number of over 20,000 people illegally detained across the country in at least 79 regions since February of 2022. According to their numbers, at least 565 people among these detained were minors, and criminal prosecution was opened against at least 9 of them before they reached the age of 18, including against 16-year-old Nikita Uvarov, who was sentenced to 5 years in prison for planning to blow up a virtual FSB building in the computer game Minecraft. All these organizations who provide us with numbers, they say, well, here are the numbers, and we're doing our best to monitor the situation, but our numbers are conservative. Bear in mind that fact. The regime has brought back the entire arsenal of Soviet-style repressive techniques using against anyone who dares protest against the official narrative, against the war, against the regime. These tactics include punitive psychiatry, like in the case of journalist Maria Ponomarenko, who, after spending several months in detention for making an online post about the bombing of the theater in Mariupol by Russian forces, was sent to a so-called psychiatric hospital for evaluation. And after her stay at that hospital, when she was able to talk to her lawyer, she said that she could not recollect 3 whole days of her stay at that hospital because she was under the influence of some unknown substances. That is punitive psychiatry that is being brought back from the Soviet era. Other repressive techniques include physical violence, extreme physical violence and sexual violence, and many cases of sexual violence reported in places of detention across the country. We talk about de facto deprivation of parental rights, like for example in the case of Alexei Moskalyov, whose daughter drew an anti-war picture at school, and he was thrown in prison for 3 years for that. Another such case is against an activist, Natalia Filonova, in Buryatia, whose adopted 15-year-old son was taken away from her and put in an orphanage while she was sent to prison to serve a sentence for protesting against the war in Ukraine. And these are the cases that lawyers or human rights activists still working on the ground in Russia have been trying to report, but these cases are numerous. We can also talk about Stalin-era prison terms, prison sentences of up to 15 years for a simple no to the war, for an anti-war graffiti, for an anti-war post, online post, for anything, any action that denounces the terrible crimes committed by the Russian army in Ukraine, any action that the goal of which is to spread truthful information about what is happening there. Any action that is trying to show to the world that the image created by state propaganda is not true. There are tens of thousands of Russians who have protested against the war since the full-scale invasion broke out, and there are probably millions who feel the same. But yes, looking at what is happening to those who do protest, they're afraid to speak up. Another absolutely atrocious case that I have to mention because it stays with me for weeks now, is a story of Anatoly Berezikov, a musician who was arrested in Rostov-on-Don for putting up flyers of the Ukrainian project I Want to Live. He was arrested, thrown in a detention center, continuously beaten up and tortured. And during the trial, he said a number of times that he was afraid to be forgotten. He was afraid that his name would just disappear. One day, when his lawyer came to visit him at the detention center, she saw his body being carried out of the center. She possesses pictures of the traces of electroshock use on him, and she believes that he was tortured to death. She herself had to flee the country after making this information public. And, you know, that person, Anatoly Berezikov, that musician, turned activist just because he couldn't do otherwise, just because he felt that he needed to do something. Who was arrested, tortured, and killed for putting up flyers of the Ukrainian project I Want to Live, also wanted to live. So I need his story and the stories of all those people who are going through something similar in Russia. I want them to be known. I need them to be known, because these people are showing to the world that they're preparing to go to very great risks, and sometimes those risks are unimaginable, to show to the world that there are a lot of Russians who want to live in a country based on human rights, based on respect for human rights and the rule of law. And those people they need to feel the support and solidarity of the Western democratic community, because that solidarity will mean a lot to them to continue the fight.